about their own life. Mara picked up the papers. She unfolded them slowly and read, and Lenore sat still and drank the coffee in small, careful sips and waited. It took several minutes. The documents were exactly what Lenore had described. The authorization letters in Calder's cramped handwriting, the payment record, the notes. The language was bureaucratic and indirect, the way people write when they want a thing done but don't want the doing of it too legible. But Mara had spent years reading ranch contracts and grain agreements and debt schedules, and she knew how to find the actual meaning inside careful language. It was there. She folded the papers and set them on the table. "Does the agency director know you've brought these to me?" "He doesn't know I took them. He knew about the arrangement and approved it, and I don't expect him to see this as anything except disloyalty." Lenore's voice was steady, but there was something under it that wasn't. "I expect I no longer have a position at Hartwell, whether they know it yet or not." "What do you want?" Mara asked. "Not moralizing. What do you actually want from bringing me this?" Lenore was quiet for a moment, which was the honest response to a direct question. "I want to not be the person who stayed quiet," she said finally. "That's it. I don't want anything from you. I have a train ticket and a sister in Ridgecroft and a month's savings. I'll manage." She paused. "There is one other thing. Calder mentioned, not to me directly, I heard it during a conversation I wasn't meant to be part of, that Crow has something planned for the auction, something beyond the buyers." Mara looked at her. "What kind of something?" "I don't know the specifics. Calder used the phrase final settlement. I heard it once and didn't hear more, but the way he said it," she stopped. "It didn't sound like another buyer arrangement." "He's going to use the debt," Mara said slowly. "The bank. Silas controls Harold Treen at the bank. If Treen brings the unpaid mortgage to the auction itself, makes it a public matter in front of the buyers, it would undermine confidence in the bid before it started," Lenore said. "It would do more than that. A public mortgage notice at auction would make every serious buyer question whether they were bidding on cattle or bidding into a legal mess." Mara's voice was controlled, but flat in the way that meant the inside was different. "That's what he's planning, not just limiting who shows up, making the auction itself a spectacle of Gideon's debt." Lenore didn't say anything. She'd given what she had. Mara stood up. She went to the window and looked out at the corrals, at the cattle moving in the afternoon light, at Dick's small in the distance, at the east field, green now all the way through. She stood there for a long time. Behind her, Lenore said quietly, "There's something else I should say. I wasn't able to stop what Calder did. But when I selected your specific file, I did that part. Calder gave me the criteria and I matched you to them." She paused. "I'm sorry for that." Mara didn't turn around. "Did you know what it was for?" "Not fully. I suspected it wasn't what was represented. I told myself the arrangement might be genuinely good for you, even if the motivation behind it wasn't." She stopped. "That was convenient thinking." "Yes," Mara said. "It was." She turned from the window. Her face was composed, the way she'd been composed on the platform 5 weeks ago, when the crowd was laughing, not performing it, just keeping herself in one piece by an act of will. "I'm not going to tell you it's fine, but I'm not going to tell you it's unforgivable either. You came. A lot of people don't." Lenore nodded once and looked at the cup in front of her. "Can I ask you something?" Lenore said. "Why did you get in the wagon that day? You knew nothing about him. You'd just been publicly humiliated. Why didn't you take the first train back?" Mara considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because going back would have proven the tag right," she said. "And I've spent most of my adult life in one version or another of that situation, someone deciding what I'm worth and putting it where everyone can see it. I didn't want to be defined by that again." She picked up the papers from the table. "Also, the ranch had potential. I could see that even from the platform. You don't survive this kind of debt situation without being resourceful. And a resourceful man with land worth fighting over is a better situation than the one I left." "That's pragmatic," Lenore said. "I'm a pragmatic person." "And the other part? The part that isn't pragmatic?" Mara was quiet for a moment. "He took the tag off," she said. "That's all. He just took it off." She said it simply, like it was a small thing, but her voice had a quality in it that said it hadn't been small. Gideon came in from the north field at 3 in the afternoon, and found Mara in the kitchen with a woman he didn't recognize and an expression on Mara's face he'd learned over 5 weeks to pay close attention to. Not alarm exactly, something more internal than that. He looked at the woman. The woman looked at him with the composed discomfort of someone who has already done the hardest part of what she came to do and is now uncertain what comes next. "Gideon," Mara said, "sit down." He sat. She gave him the papers. She watched him read them the way she'd read them herself, slowly at first, then going back, then with the stillness of a man absorbing something that reconfigures what he thought he knew. He didn't say anything until he'd read through all of them, and then he set them on the table and sat for a long moment with his hands flat on his thighs. "He arranged the match," he said. "He paid for you to come here." "Yes." "Because he thought I'd be the thing that finished you off," Mara said. "No family to complain to the agency, visible financial difficulty, a history of situations falling apart. He expected me to look at the books and leave, or stay and be one more cost you couldn't absorb." She paused. He chose wrong. Gideon looked at the papers again. Something was moving across his face that wasn't easy to name. Not just anger, which would have been simpler, but something under the anger that was more complicated. The particular feeling of discovering that a wound you thought was bad luck was actually deliberate. That changed things. It changed the texture of the last 2 years. He looked at Lenora. "You worked for the agency." "I did," she said, "and you knew what the arrangement was. Not fully, enough to be uncomfortable, not enough to stop it." She met his eyes without flinching, which was the correct response. "I'm sorry for my part in it, Mr. Hale." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Mara. "The documents," he said. "Can they be used?" "That's the question," Mara said. "Legally, I'm not certain. We'd need someone who understands the law better than either of us. But at the auction—" She paused, working through it. "At the auction, in front of buyers, in front of the town, a public account of what Silas did, with documentation, is a different thing from a legal case. It's a reputational argument, and the person who needs to make it isn't us." Gideon looked at her. "Lenora," Mara said, "you'd have to be willing to say it publicly, not in a courtroom, at the auction, in front of people." Lenora had not moved. She sat with her hands folded on the table now, the satchel on the floor beside her. "I came here," she said. "I didn't come halfway." Gideon studied her, the impulse to trust, the impulse to be skeptical, both of them working against each other. "Why should we believe you're not another arrangement?" he said. "Another piece of something Silas built." "You shouldn't," Lenora said, without defensiveness. "Not on my word alone. The documents are what they are regardless of what you think of me. Have someone else verify the handwriting and the payment records. Calder's name is on those letters. He's not a careful man when he thinks no one is watching." "She's right," Mara said. "Verify them. But also—" She looked at Gideon. "She didn't have to come. Coming here cost her something. That's worth something, too." He thought about this. He was a man who moved slowly toward trust, not because he was suspicious by nature, but because the last 2 years had arranged themselves specifically to teach him what happened when you extended trust to situations you hadn't fully assessed. He looked at the documents again, then at Lenora, then at Mara. "There's something else," Mara said. She told him about Calder's comment, the phrase "final settlement," the auction, Harold Treen, and the bank mortgage. As she laid it out, his expression changed in the subtle way of a man following a line of reasoning he doesn't want to arrive at the end of but can already see the destination. "He's going to make the debt public at the auction," Gideon said. "That's what it sounds like. Treen would do it. He's terrified of Silas, and he'd dress it up as the bank's fiduciary responsibility." His voice had gone quiet and flat. "If he stands up at that auction and makes a public statement about outstanding debt before the bidding starts, it poisons the room," Mara said. "Buyers who came in neutral leave skeptical. Buyers who were already being pressured by Silas have their excuse." She put her hands on the table. "So we have to get there first." "Get where first?" "The debt. We have to address it before Treen can weaponize it." She was thinking out loud, the pencil appearing in her hand from nowhere, the way it always did when she was working something through. "If we go into that auction having already spoken to the legitimate question of the debt, its size, the payment schedule, what the auction will produce and why, Then Treen has nothing to reveal. He can only confirm what everyone already knows. That's a different kind of strategy, Gideon said. Going to the auction and saying, here's what we owe. It's transparency, Mara said. People in that room are ranchers. Most of them have had debt. They know how it works. What they don't trust is when someone tries to hide it. If we hide it and Treen reveals it, it looks like shame. If we say it first, it looks like confidence. He considered this. Outside, the light was going amber, the afternoon shortening the way November afternoons did. Boyd Reeves, he said. Reeves needs to walk that herd before the auction, and his word needs to be in the room before Silas or Treen opens their mouths. She tapped the table. We need 3 things to work in sequence. Reeves validates the cattle the week before. We set the debt record straight openly at the auction's opening. And Lenora gives a public account of Silas's arrangement with the agency when Silas tries to make his move. That last part, he looked at Lenora. If Silas realizes you've talked, he'll be angry, Lenora said. I understand that. It's more than anger. He has reach, his people. I'm not staying in this territory, Lenora said. I have a sister in Ridgecroft. After the auction, I'm gone. She paused. I have thought about this, Mr. Hale. I didn't come here on impulse. He looked at Mara. It's her choice, Mara said. Not ours to make for her. He nodded slowly. All right. He looked at the documents. I need to get these to a reliable pair of hands before the auction. Someone who can verify them and who's not in Silas's pocket. He thought. There's a man in the county seat, a solicitor named Arthur Vane. He's retired from active practice, but his opinion still carries weight. If Vane confirms these documents are what they claim to be, that's something Silas can't simply dismiss. Can you get to him before the auction? Mara asked. 8 days. Vane's a 2-day ride each way. He looked at his hands. I'd have to leave the ranch. Pete and I can manage 8 days, Mara said. He looked at her. The fences on the north section. I know about the fences. I've been watching that stretch for 2 weeks. We'll manage. He seemed to want to argue the point on principle and couldn't find the specific objection. I'll leave tomorrow morning, he said. First light. That night no one slept easily. Lenora had been given the spare room, and Gideon could hear her moving once or twice. Not pacing, just the small sounds of a person in an unfamiliar place, restless with what she'd done and what was coming. He lay on his back and stared at the ceiling and ran through the pieces of what they'd built and what could still fail. The list was not short. It never was. He thought about Silas's face at the platform, that particular smile, the way he'd held the tag up for the crowd like he was presenting evidence of something. He'd been so certain. That was the thing that stayed with Gideon, lying in the dark. Silas had been so completely certain of how it would go. The woman would arrive and be a wait or be a departure, and either way, Iron Creek would weaken. The debt would accumulate, the bank would move, the land would change hands. He hadn't accounted for Mara, which was his first real mistake in 3 years of very few mistakes. In a room at the end of the hall, Mara lay awake with the documents folded on the bedside table and thought about Lenora's question. Why did you get in the wagon? The answer she'd given was true. The part about not wanting to be defined by the tag, the part about the ranch's potential. All of it was true. What she hadn't said, because she was still examining whether it was real or just sentiment, was the other thing. The thing about Gideon walking through that crowd without hurrying, without performing anything, and untying a red piece of twine from a trunk handle. It was such a small action. It cost him nothing measurable. It changed nothing in the immediate situation. The crowd was still there. Silas was still there. The debt was still there. But it was the kind of thing that told you about a person more than any amount of deliberate presentation. Not what someone did when they were trying to show you who they were, but what they did automatically, without thinking about how it looked, in a situation where most people would have calculated first. She hadn't been able to articulate why that mattered so much. She still couldn't exactly. But lying in the dark, with the papers on the bedside table and the sounds of the ranch settling into its nighttime rhythms, she thought that maybe it didn't need to be articulated. Some things were clear without language. She turned over and let herself get a few hours. The morning Gideon rode out, the temperature had dropped overnight, and there was a suggestion of frost on the grass that hadn't fully committed by the time the sun came over the hills. He was saddled and packed by 5:30, and Mara came out to the porch in her coat with two things: the documents, refolded into oilskin for weather protection, and a sealed letter she'd written the previous evening. "What's this?" he said, taking the letter. "For Vane." Background on the agency arrangement from my perspective. It corroborates what the documents say, but in my own words, he may want it. He put it in his saddlebag. He checked the documents were secure. He looked at the ranch behind her, the house, the corrals, the barn, the east field green and steady in the early light. 8 days, he said. 8 days, she agreed. He looked at her. There was a moment where something could have been said that neither of them had a clear enough claim on yet, and they were both aware of it and both let it pass. He touched his hat brim and rode. She stood on the porch and watched him until he cleared the gate, and then she turned and went back inside where Pete was already at the stove and the day was already asking for things. The 3 days that followed were steady and unremarkable in the way of days that are carrying pressure without showing it. Mara ran the feeding schedule and the field rotation and checked the north fence and managed a supply delivery and kept the hands moving in the direction the work required. Lenora stayed out of the way with a tactfulness that Mara appreciated. She helped where she could, asked permission before she assumed, and spent her evenings quietly at the kitchen table writing letters to her sister in Ridgecroft. On the 4th day, 2 things happened. The first was that one of Silas's men was spotted at the fence line of the north section, on horseback, looking at the property. Not trespassing, just looking. Tom Beckett saw him on the morning ride and reported it to Pete without drama. "Counting cattle, neat," Pete said. "Counting fence posts," Tom said. "Specifically the ones that aren't holding," Pete told Mara. Mara looked at the north section fence on her morning walk and then came back and found Dick's. "North fence," she said. "The stretch by the creek bend. I need you and Ned on it today." Dix didn't argue. He'd stopped arguing about most things around day 12. "How bad is it?" "Manageable today, not manageable if we wait." They fixed the fence in 4 hours, which was not a comfortable 4 hours in the November cold with the wind off the creek. But it was 4 hours spent not having cattle scattered across open territory the night before Boyd Reeves arrived. The second thing was a letter from Silas Crow. It was addressed to Gideon, but Pete brought it to Mara since Gideon was away. And Mara opened it without any particular guilt, because under the current circumstances, what was Gideon's business was also her business. The letter was brief. It reiterated Silas's standing offer to purchase the north section at a price that was exactly 60% of its actual value. It noted, with the polished indirection Silas favored, that circumstances surrounding the upcoming auction made this offer likely the most stable financial path available. It expressed a desire to resolve the matter before public proceedings make resolution more complicated for all parties. Mara read it twice. He put it on the kitchen table with the envelope and wrote 2 words in pencil at the top of the page. "He knows." She didn't mean Silas knew about Lenora. Not yet. She meant Silas knew something was shifting, and the letter was his way of testing whether they'd flinch. She left the letter on the table where Gideon would find it when he returned. Then she went out to check the Hereford crosses because Reeves was 4 days out, and she wanted the animals at their best. That evening, sitting at the kitchen table after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, Lenora said quietly, "He's not going to stop." "No," Mara agreed. "Even if the auction goes right, he'll find another angle." Probably. She was working on the weight records, updating the log for Reeves's visit. But an auction loss in front of the whole valley, buyers, ranchers, the bank, that changes his position. Silas runs on the certainty that people believe he wins. Break that once publicly, and the next conversation is different. Lenora was quiet for a moment. "And if it doesn't go right?" Mara looked up. She held Lenora's eyes for a moment. "Then we figure out what's next," she said. "That's all you can ever do." It wasn't a reassuring answer, but it was an honest one, and Lenora seemed to understand that the honesty was what was on offer and accepted it accordingly. Outside the night was deep and cold, and the cattle were quiet in the corrals, and the north fence was holding, and somewhere on a road between here and the county seat, Gideon Hale was riding toward a man who could change what the documents in the oilskin meant. 4 days to Reeves. Whatever was going to happen was going to happen. All they could do was be ready for it. Gideon came back on the 7th day, not the 8th. Mara heard the horse before she saw him, the particular cadence of a tired animal that had been pushed harder than comfortable over the last stretch of road. She was in the barn when he rode through the gate, and she came out and took the reins while he dismounted with the stiffness of someone who'd been in a saddle for too many consecutive hours. He looked at her. His face was trail-worn and unreadable in the particular way of a man carrying information he hasn't decided how to deliver yet. Vane authenticated them, he said. She let out a breath she hadn't fully acknowledged she'd been holding. All of it? Every document? The handwriting, the payment authorization, the meeting notes. He said Calder's signature is consistent across multiple records he was able to cross-reference. He took his saddlebag from the horse. He also wrote a letter of attestation, his own hand, his own seal, confirming what the documents show and his professional opinion of their authenticity. Does Vane understand what it's for? I told him everything. Gideon handed her the saddlebag. He's not young and he's not naive and he's had his own history with Silas's way of doing business. He said, he stopped and something crossed his face that was close to wry. He said he'd been waiting 15 years for someone to bring him something he could put his name next to against that man. They stood in the yard in the cold morning air, and Mara opened the saddlebag and checked the oilskin package. Intact. The letter of attestation was folded inside, the wax seal unbroken. 2 days, she said. Reeves arrives tomorrow. Auction the day after. I know. He looked at the corrals. How are the cattle? Ready, she said. Come see. She walked him through the corrals before he'd even changed his coat, because that was the right order of priorities, and he understood that. The Hereford crosses had held their weight through the week. The Angus calves were within range of the numbers she'd projected. The herd moved through the morning light with the solid, unhurried quality of well-managed animals, and Gideon walked among them with his hand against their flanks and said nothing for a long time. Pete came up beside him. The 3 from the East group came in 2 pounds under where she wanted them, Pete said, nodding at Mara. Everything else is within range. 2 pounds under won't matter if Reeves sees what I think he'll see, Mara said. Gideon put his hand on the shoulder of the largest Hereford cross. The animal turned its head to look at him with the mild incuriosity of a creature that is sufficiently fed and comfortable. He looked at its condition, the coat, the weight distribution, the way it stood. He'd raised cattle his whole life. He knew what healthy looked like. They're good, he said. They're better than good, Pete said, which was more words of approval than Pete had strung together in one direction in 22 years. Brocheets. Boyd Reeves arrived the following morning in a wagon driven by a young man who appeared to be his nephew and who handled the horses with the quiet competence of someone raised to do it correctly. Reeves himself was exactly what Gideon had described, a solid 60, deeply tanned, moving with the economical deliberateness of a man who'd spent years making sure each action counted. He had the kind of eyes that looked at things and actually recorded what they saw rather than confirming what they expected. He shook Gideon's hand on the porch. He looked at Mara with a measuring quality that wasn't unfriendly. This the woman running your operation? He said to Gideon. Running it with me, Gideon said. Reeves looked at Mara directly. That right? That's right, Mara said. He studied her for a moment. Where'd you work before? She told him. He nodded at the Kansas operations with the recognition of someone who knew them by reputation, and his expression shifted slightly at the name of the second one. Heard that place had problems, he said. It did, Mara said, not operational ones. He looked at her a moment longer, weighing something, and then apparently made a decision. Show me the cattle, he said. She did. She walked him through every section of the herd, methodically, without rushing him and without narrating every detail in the way of someone trying to sell something. She answered his questions when he asked them and stayed quiet when he didn't. He asked specific questions, feed composition, weight gain timeline, the nature of the illness that had reduced the herd 2 years prior, water access, grazing rotation. He crouched beside the youngest calves and checked condition with his hands, and he looked at the East Field's recovery with the attention of someone who understood what restored grazing land meant for a herd's future. He asked hard questions where there were hard answers, and she gave him the hard answers, because Gideon had said correctly that Reeves valued being right more than being comfortable, And the only way to have Boyd Reeves in your corner was to give him accurate material to work with. The weight gains on the Hereford crosses, he said, standing in the North Corral. You're saying 6 weeks of recovery management produced this. 6 weeks in better feed. The previous grain supply was underperforming. Why was it underperforming? The supplier is Silas Crow's nephew. Reeves looked at her. His expression didn't change, but something behind it sharpened. Is that so? It is. We've been sourcing out of Dunmore since week 3. The difference in the cattle is partly visible in the weight records if you'd like to see the log. I'd like to see the log, he said. She showed him the log. He read it with the focused attention he gave everything, turning pages, going back occasionally. He said nothing during this, and she didn't fill the silence. Finally, he handed it back. What's Crow planning for tomorrow? He said. She looked at him. You know about his involvement. I know Silas Crow. I know how he operates in a valley when he wants something. I've watched him work for 20 years from a distance. Reeves looked across the corrals. I turned down his offer to join his exchange network because a man who won't accept a fair market doesn't believe in markets. He believes in control. He paused. What's he planning? She told him about the bank, about Treen and the mortgage, about the intent to make the debt a public event at the auction itself. Reeves listened without interruption. And the other thing, he said when she'd finished, the agency arrangement. She stopped. You know about that. I heard something from a contact in town. People talk. He looked at her steadily. Is there documentation? Authenticated by Arthur Vane, she said. Something moved across Reeves's face. It wasn't a smile exactly, but it was in the neighborhood of one. Vane, he said. Old Arthur's still willing to put his name on things. Apparently he's been waiting for the right thing. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Who's going to say it publicly? At the auction. The woman from the agency. She came here voluntarily. She's willing. He absorbed this. Then, what do you need from me? Walk this herd in front of the auction crowd and say what you actually think of them, Mara said. That's all. Just what you actually think. He looked at the cattle. He was quiet long enough that she resisted the urge to say anything more. That was the correct instinct. She held it. These are good cattle, Reeves said. Whoever managed this recovery knows what they're doing. I'll say that tomorrow because it's true. He looked at her. Not because you asked me to. I know, she said. Good, he said. As long as we're clear. The night before the auction, Silas Crow's men cut the north fence. They did it at 2 a.m, a clean cut in 3 sections across the creek bend stretch, where the fence was oldest and where, until a week ago, it had been the weakest. The cattle that had been in the North Corral were through the gap and into the open country beyond before anyone at the ranch was awake. It was the dog that woke Pete, a mongrel he kept at the bunkhouse for no formal reason, which started raising noise at 2:15 and didn't stop until Pete got up and looked. He had the lantern and was at the north fence within 10 minutes. Then he was at Mara's window. She was dressed in 4 minutes, Gideon in 3. Tom and Ned were at the barn before either of them, pulling saddles down from the racks with the focused speed of people who have dealt with this kind of emergency before. Dix appeared in the barn doorway. How many got through? North Corral was 14 head, Pete said. Maybe 12 through the gap, maybe all 14. Dark. Which direction? Mara said, cinching her horse. Creek bends east, they'll follow the water. They rode out in pairs. Gideon and Pete east along the creek, Tom and Ned angling north to cut off any animals that had broken that way, Mara and Dix taking the open ground south of the fence line where the grass was flat and a spooked animal might run farther than the water would pull it. The night was cold and moonless, the stars doing very little practical work, and for the first hour it was difficult work in near darkness, moving slowly, calling, listening for sounds that weren't wind or creek. Mara's horse was good in the dark, picking its way without drama, and she let it make the decisions about footing while she watched for movement and listened. Dix was 20 feet to her left and said almost nothing. They'd been working together long enough by now that the silence between them was functional rather than awkward. Over there, he said suddenly, low and calm. She saw it. 3 animals against the slightly lighter dark of the open sky, moving at a slow graze about 200 yards out. Not panicked, just gone through an opening and finding grass, and not particularly aware they were somewhere they weren't supposed to be. They brought those 3 back without incident. Ned had found 4 near the creek, where the water had apparently reassured them into stopping. Tom had 2 more. Gideon and Pete came back at 4:15 with 5 between them, driving them carefully through the dark. That was 14. All 14. Pete checked the gap in the north fence with his lantern, while the others drove the recovered animals back into the south corral for the night. 3 clean cuts, wire ends folded back with pliers, done quickly and by someone who knew what they were doing. Professional, Pete said, to nobody in particular. Yes, Mara said. She was standing over the fence looking at the cuts. Her hands were cold, and her coat was wet from a creek crossing, and she was tired in the deep way of someone who'd been pushed past their limit and was running on something other than rest. Dick stood beside her. You think it was Silas's people? He said. I don't think anything, she said. I know. She turned. Get a couple hours of sleep. We ride to town at 7. Dix looked at her for a moment. In the dark and the lantern light, his face had something on it that hadn't been there 6 weeks ago. We're going to win this, he said, not asking. We're going to try very hard, she said. That's what I can promise. It was the right answer. Dick seemed to understand that and didn't push for a better one. But the Black Ridge auction ground was a large flat area at the eastern edge of town, half livestock yard and half open gathering space, where twice a year the valley's cattle business concentrated itself in a few hours of organized chaos. By 8 in the morning, there were already 40 people there, and by the time Gideon arrived with Pete and the hands driving the herd at 9:15, the crowd had grown to something closer to 80. Mara rode at the back of the herd with Tom. She'd been awake since 2 in the morning and had slept perhaps 90 minutes before the fence, and her eyes had the particular flatness of someone operating beyond their comfortable range. But she was upright and her mind was functioning, which was what mattered. She saw Silas before she was through the gate. He was at the far side of the auction ground with Harold Treen beside him, a nervous, soft man in a good coat who kept looking at the papers in his hand as though reminding himself they existed. Silas himself was in his standard presentation, composed, well-dressed, with the particular ease of a man who has arrived at a place where he expects things to go his way. He saw Mara. He looked at her with the expression of a man noticing a variable he'd discounted and reconsidering whether it requires attention. Then he looked at the cattle coming through the gate. Something in his expression changed, almost too slight to read, but she'd been watching Silas Crow for 6 weeks through other people's accounts and one direct encounter, and she knew what confident looked like on his face. What she was seeing now was something slightly different, not uncertainty, but the first faint suggestion that the numbers weren't quite what he'd expected. She looked away and focused on the herd. Boyd Reeves was already positioned near the center of the auction ground. He'd arrived before the hail party, which meant he'd made a point of being there, which meant something. He was talking to 2 men Mara didn't know, buyers from their coats and their manor from somewhere north of the valley. She noted this and filed it. The formal proceedings started at 10 o'clock, run by the auction's coordinator, a gravel-voiced man named Hollis who'd been doing this job for 15 years and treated drama the way a river treated obstacles. It went around. He called the morning to order, established the sequence, and invited any preliminary business. Gideon stepped forward before anyone else could. He'd asked Mara the night before whether he should be the one to do it. She'd said yes without hesitation. This was his ranch, his name, his community. She could tell him what to say, but she couldn't say it for him, and it would land differently coming from a man the valley knew than from a woman most of them had only heard about. I want to address the Iron Creek debt before the bidding starts, Gideon said. His voice was steady and carried easily in the cold morning air. People turned. Silas's expression sharpened slightly. The First Territorial Bank holds a loan on Iron Creek Ranch. The amount is not a secret. What today's auction will produce is sufficient to clear that loan entirely. I'm not asking anyone to take that on faith. The herd's weight records are available for inspection, and Boyd Reeves examined the full stock yesterday afternoon. I'd like him to speak to what he found. There was a murmur in the crowd. Hollis raised his eyebrows, but didn't object. This was, technically, within the preliminary business category. Reeves moved to the front without being summoned, with the unhurried authority of a man who doesn't need to establish his standing because it's already established. He looked at the crowd for a moment, I've been assessing cattle for 40 years, he said. The Iron Creek herd is one of the better recovery operations I've seen in this territory. The Hereford crosses are at full market weight. The Angus calves are close to it. The grazing management is sound. He paused. I don't say things I don't believe, and I don't travel 40 miles to look at cattle. I wouldn't bid on myself if I were still in that business. He stepped back. The murmur changed quality. Mara watched the faces of the buyers Reeves had been speaking to earlier. They were attentive in a different way now. The particular attentiveness of people recalibrating their position before the bidding started. Silas moved. He stepped forward with the smooth confidence of someone executing a prepared plan. Hollis, he said, before we proceed, the bank has a statement relevant to the integrity of this auction. He turned to Treen with a slight nod. Harold Treen, who was holding his papers with both hands now and visibly sweating in 40-degree air, stepped forward, and Lenora Briggs spoke first. She'd been at the edge of the crowd, which was where Mara had suggested she stand, visible but not centered, present but not positioned in a way that looked staged. She spoke with a carrying voice that surprised people who hadn't expected her to speak at all. My name is Lenora Briggs. I was an agent with the Hartwell Matrimonial Agency. I am here because 4 months ago, Silas Crow's representative paid the Hartwell Agency to place a specific woman at Iron Creek Ranch, not to help the ranch, to weaken it. She held up the document packet. The selection criteria were documented in writing. The payment was documented. The intent was that the woman placed would appear to be a burden on an already struggling operation. Arthur Vane of the county seat has authenticated these documents and provided a letter of attestation. The crowd had gone completely still. Silas turned toward her with the controlled expression of a man deciding, very fast, how to respond to something he didn't expect from this direction. This woman has no standing here, he said calmly. Whatever she's claiming, the documents have Calder's signature, Lenora said. Mr. Vane confirmed it. If anyone would like to examine them, they're available. She set the packet on the nearest fence rail and stepped back. No one moved for a moment. Then one of the North buyers walked over and picked up the packet. That was the thing, Mara understood later, that Silas hadn't been able to prepare for. Not the documents themselves. He might have been able to dispute a claim, might have been able to redirect or overwhelm with counter-argument, but a respected buyer from outside the valley picking up papers in front of 80 people and reading them with focused attention. That was a visual that traveled faster than any argument. Treen had not spoken during any of this. He was still holding his papers. He looked at Silas. Silas looked at the buyer reading Vane's attestation. The buyer said something to his colleague. The colleague took the document and read it himself. Treen put his papers back in his coat. It was such a small action, such a quiet retreat. But Mara saw it, and Gideon saw it, and Pete saw it. And in the front row of the crowd, a rancher named Carver, who had done business with both Iron Creek and Silas Crow over the years, turned and said something to the man beside him that involved a very specific gesture toward Silas. Hollis cleared his throat. I'll call the bidding open, he said. Iron Creek herd, 63 head, lot 1. Who'll start? The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Corville, who Mara had identified as the swing buyer, opened low. As she'd predicted, a conservative number positioned to leave room, the kind of bid that said, I'm here, but I'm watching which way this breaks. Then one of the North buyers put in a number that was 30% higher. Corville looked at him. The crowd shifted. The second North buyer came in higher still. Silas's men, 2 buyers he'd spoken to, who had been hovering at the edge of the crowd in the particular way of people with instructions, didn't move. One of them glanced at Silas. Silas's face was absolutely controlled, which was the only thing that was giving anything away. Men whose plans are proceeding don't control their faces that carefully. Corville bid again, higher than his opening by a significant margin. He'd read the room. The room had turned back and forth. The North buyers, then Corville, then a rancher Mara didn't know from the south end of the valley, who apparently had his own reasons for wanting good Hereford stock and had come in prepared to pay for it. The number climbed past what Gideon had projected, past what Mara had calculated as the realistic ceiling. It went somewhere above that ceiling and held there for a moment while the bidders looked at each other with the mutual assessment of people deciding whether the next increment was worth it. Corville bid once more. Nobody answered. Hollis called it. The sound of the gavel was not dramatic in itself, a wood block against a rail, a purely practical noise, but it produced in the crowd around it something that traveled through the people there the way certain sounds travel, with an effect larger than the sound itself. Gideon stood with his hat in his hands and his eyes on the ground for a moment. Pete put a hand on his shoulder briefly and removed it. Mara was standing 6 feet back and she didn't move. She was cold and tired, and her eyes were stinging from the sleepless night and the cold air, and she was looking at the herd in their temporary lot. The Hereford crosses, the Angus calves, all the animals she'd spent 6 weeks rebuilding. And she was thinking about none of the dramatic things. She was thinking about a calf she'd sat with in a cold shed, watching it breathe. About drainage channels in November mud. About numbers in a ledger at a kitchen table at midnight. About the East Field coming back slow, the way fields do, the way things do when the work is real. Mara. Gideon was beside her. His voice had something in it she hadn't heard from him before. She looked at him. It cleared, he said. The full debt. And there's remainder. She held his eyes. I know, she said. I did the math. He looked at her for a moment, and then he laughed. A real laugh. The unpracticed kind. The kind that happens before a person decides whether to let it. And she found herself doing the same. Not because it was a clean, happy moment, but because it was a real one. And after 6 weeks of hard work and bad sleep and fence cutting in the dark and everything else, real was exactly what it was. Silas left before the second lot closed. He walked out of the auction ground with his coat straight and his hat level and his face doing the controlled work it had been doing all morning. His 2 men followed. Harold Treen, who had stayed in the crowd after the moment with his papers, watched him go and then seemed to remember he was supposed to be somewhere else and went there. The North buyer who had read Vane's attestation spent 20 minutes afterward in conversation with 2 other ranchers. Mara didn't know what was said. She didn't need to know. The nature of the conversation was legible in the body language of the men having it, that particular forward-leaning attention of people discussing something they want to act on. Reeves found her near the gate when the auction crowd was beginning to dissolve into the midday flow of town business. Your cattle, he said. The remainder of the operation. What's the plan? Build the herd back to capacity over the next season. Improve the east grazing section. The water access on the north is solid. She paused. There are some things that would be better with a wider market relationship. The Crestfall Exchange has a spot opening in the Spring Sellers Register, Reeves said. A legitimate spot, not Crow's arrangement. He looked at her. Iron Creek would need to meet the quality threshold. We'll meet it. He studied her the way he'd studied the cattle, methodically, making an actual determination. I believe you will, he said. He touched his hat brim and walked away, which was as much endorsement as Boyd Reeves gave anyone. She went to find Lenora. Lenora was at the edge of the auction ground with her satchel and her traveling coat, looking like what she was. A woman who had done a hard thing and was now waiting to see what came next. She saw Mara coming, and her expression asked the question before she did. It worked, Mara said. Lenora let out a breath. The documents, did they? Treen put his papers away and never spoke. Silas left early. She paused. You did that. Your being here, speaking first, before Treen could move. That was the sequence. Lenora was quiet for a moment. She looked at the dispersing crowd, the last of the buyers and ranchers moving toward the street. I keep wondering if it was enough, she said, for what I was part of. I'm not going to tell you what's enough, Mara said. That's not mine to tell. She looked at her. What I can tell you is that you came here and did a difficult thing in public, and it mattered. What you do with that is up to you. Lenora nodded slowly. She picked up her satchel. I have a train at 3 o'clock. Do you have what you need to get to Ridgecroft? I have enough. She paused. Mara, I hope this... She stopped, changed course. I hope Iron Creek is everything it should be. I think it will be, Mara said. They didn't embrace. It wasn't that kind of relationship. Too much history between them that wasn't comfortable. Too much that couldn't be undone. But they looked at each other for a moment with the mutual recognition of 2 people who had been part of something difficult and had both, in the end, been on the right side of it. Lenora walked toward the street. Mara watched her go and then turned back to where Gideon was standing with Pete and the hands near the gate, and she walked toward them through the thinning crowd. And above Black Ridge the sky was clear and hard and very blue, and the morning that had started in the dark with cut fences and cold water was resolving into something entirely different. Not easy, not clean, not the way things ended in stories where everything arrives neatly, but real. And for now, real was more than enough. The ride back to Iron Creek that afternoon was quiet, in the way that follows something large. Not peaceful exactly, too many edges still exposed for that, but the particular quiet of people who have been running at full speed and suddenly find the ground leveled beneath them and don't quite know yet how to move at a different pace. Gideon drove the wagon. Pete rode alongside. The hands trailed behind with the easy looseness of men who had worked hard and come through it. Mara sat on the wagon bench and watched the valley road unspool ahead of them and let herself be tired in a way she hadn't permitted during the 6 weeks prior. The cold had eased slightly by mid-afternoon, the sun doing what it could through the November overcast, and the grass on either side of the road held its winter gold color that she'd been looking at long enough now that it had become familiar. She knew this road. She knew the bend where the cottonwoods started, and the place where the creek came closest to the road, and the gate post with the slight lean that Pete had been meaning to reset for 2 months. She knew Iron Creek the way you know a place when you've been paying close attention to it for reasons that matter. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected to know a place this quickly, or to feel its condition in the particular way she felt it. The same way you know when someone you care about isn't sleeping well, the way you can tell from small signs that most people wouldn't register. That knowledge had crept up on her without announcing itself. "You're quiet," Gideon said. "I'm tired," she said. "That's not the same thing." She looked at him. He was watching the road with the half-attention of a man driving a familiar route, his hands easy on the reins. He'd lost the trail-worn tightness from his face since he'd come back from Vane's. Something in him had released, not completely, not the way things release in stories when the problem is solved. It was subtler than that. Like a hand that has been gripping something too hard for too long and is just beginning to remember how to be open. "I was thinking about what comes next," she said. "The Crestfall Exchange registration. Reeves mentioned spring. That and the herd rebuild. We're at 63 head, and that's not where we need to be." She looked at the road. "The north section's water access is the asset we haven't fully used. If we expand the grazing rotation in spring..." "Mara," she stopped. "Not today," he said. "Let it be today for a few more hours." She considered this. The impulse to plan was the impulse to keep moving, and keeping moving was how she'd managed uncertainty for most of her adult life. If you were planning, you were doing something. If you stopped planning, you were just sitting with whatever the situation was, and that was harder. But he wasn't wrong. "All right," she said. "Not today." They rode the rest of the way in a quieter quiet, and it was different from the first quiet, more settled, less maintained. The ranch received them without ceremony, which was the correct reception. The animals in the south corral needed feeding. The barn needed the day's last check. There was dinner to produce and the evening's accounting to at least note if not fully complete. Pete and the hands fell back into the rhythm of the work the way water falls back into a channel, and within an hour of their return, Iron Creek looked and sounded like what it was. A working ranch on a November afternoon, doing the things that needed doing. Mara changed her coat and helped with the feeding and checked the 3 calves she'd been monitoring and found them all in acceptable condition. Dix, passing her in the corral, said, "Good day," which from Dix was a speech. She said, "It was," and they went their separate ways, which was exactly the right exchange for where they were with each other. Not warm friends, never going to be, but people who had figured out how to work together in a way that served the thing they were both trying to do. That was worth something. That was, in its own way, worth quite a lot. At dinner, Tom Beckett, who almost never initiated conversation, said, "You think Crow will try something else?" The table was quiet for a moment. "Probably," Mara said. "Men like that don't stop because they lost one round. They recalculate." She passed the bread. "But his position in the valley is different now. Those documents are in Vane's hands, and Vane has a copy, and the North buyers saw them. The word will travel." She looked at Tom. "He can still cause problems. He can't cause the specific problem he was building toward. That's gone. And Trine, Pete said, Trine is going to have a very uncomfortable period of working out whose influence he's actually willing to live with, Gideon said. He said it without particular satisfaction, just assessment. He made a choice today by not speaking. That's going to have its own consequences with Silas, and I don't think Trine fully understood that when he put those papers back in his coat. He looked like he understood it, Pete said. He just couldn't see a better option. That's usually how people end up in Silas's orbit, Mara said. Not because they want to be there, because they can't see a way out that costs less than staying. Ned was leaning back in his chair with the posture of a man who has worked a very long day and is letting the food do its work. What about the agency? He said. Hartwell. Lenore is the one who knows what happens there, Mara said. She took the documents, she left. Whether the agency faces any formal consequences depends on things I can't predict. She was quiet for a moment. What I know is that Calder put his signature on those letters and Vane has them. That tends to have effects eventually. The conversation moved to other things. The south fence, the winter supply order, whether the youngest Angus calf was going to hold its weight into the cold months. Normal things. Ranch things. The kind of conversation that happened at tables where people had eaten together long enough to run out of performing and into just talking. Mara sat at the table and listened and contributed where she had something to contribute, and she thought about how different this felt from the first dinner, 6 weeks ago, when she'd sat in the same chair and the hands had received her with the careful politeness of people waiting to see what she was. They knew now. She knew them. That knowing had been built out of specific things, cold mornings and drainage mud and fence repairs and the weight of calves and arguments about grazing rotation that weren't really arguments, just two people figuring out the right answer. There was nothing sentimental about how it had happened. It had happened because the work was real and the stakes were real, and real circumstances, sustained long enough, have a way of cutting through most of the distance between people. Not all of it. Some distance was permanent, and that was fine, but enough of it. Basset. 3 days after the auction, a writer came from the First Territorial Bank. Not Trine himself, a young bank clerk with the look of someone who had been given an assignment he wasn't certain about and was carrying it out with careful precision. He brought a document confirming the full satisfaction of the Iron Creek loan, stamped and dated, with a second paper that was a formal release of the mortgage lien on the property. Gideon read both documents at the kitchen table. He read them twice, not because the language was unclear, but because the thing the language said was something he'd been holding in the future tense for so long that the present tense didn't feel entirely stable yet. He set them on the table. Mara was across from him with her coffee, watching him read. She didn't say anything. She understood that this was a thing he needed a minute with, and she gave him the minute. My father took out the original mortgage in 1871, Gideon said. It was refinanced twice. Once when we lost the east barn to a fire, and once when I needed to expand the herd after he died. He was looking at the release document. I've been paying on some version of this debt for 9 years. It's done now, Mara said. It's done now, he repeated. He said it like he was testing the weight of it. He picked up the release document and held it for a moment. Then he folded it carefully, the way you fold something you're going to keep rather than file, and set it beside the full satisfaction notice. I want to do something with these, he said. What kind of something? He didn't answer immediately. She watched him think about it, the quality of his thinking visible in the slight change around his eyes, the way his hands rested on the table. He was, she had learned, a man who moved through ideas carefully, not because he was slow, but because he believed in not moving until he knew where he was going. The tag, he said, from the platform. She looked at him. I still have it, he said. I kept it in my coat, and then I put it in the desk drawer, and I didn't throw it away because he stopped. I'm not entirely sure why I didn't throw it away. Because it was the beginning of something, she said. You don't throw away the beginning of something. He looked at her across the table. I want to put them together, he said, the tag and the release, somewhere in the house. Not as a decoration, just somewhere they can be what they are. She understood what he meant. Some things didn't need to be displayed or explained. They just needed to exist in the right place, where the right people could see them and know what they represented without having to narrate it. The front room, she said, above the window. Yes, he said, that's exactly right. The conversation they needed to have, the one that had been building since the platform and the wagon ride and the kitchen table at midnight and everything after, happened on a Saturday in early December when the first real snow came. It wasn't a dramatic snow. It was the tentative early winter kind, more suggestion than statement, the flakes small and intermittent, the ground not quite cold enough yet to hold everything that fell. But by mid-morning, the north field had a thin white cover, and the corrals were dusted, and the cottonwoods along the creek were doing the thing they did in first snow, holding each flake separately on the branches for a moment before the branch gave and released them all at once. Mara had been checking the water troughs, making sure the cold hadn't started any freezing in the supply lines, when Gideon came out and walked beside her without particular announcement. They worked through the trough check together, moving along the fence line, their breath visible in the cold air. At the far end of the north corral, where the fence faced the open view of the valley, they stopped. The snow fell around them in its intermittent way. Below, Black Ridge was a small cluster of geometry against the pale winter landscape. "I want to ask you something," Gideon said. "All right, not about the ranch." She looked at him. He was watching the valley with the careful gaze of a man who has thought about what he's going to say and is still not entirely certain of it. "I don't know how to do this in a way that's separate from everything else," he said. "The ranch, the arrangement, the agency, it's all tangled together and I can't pretend it isn't, but I want to try to say something that isn't about any of that." He paused. "Mara, you came here under circumstances that were designed to be difficult. You stayed when you didn't have to. You built something out of a situation that was meant to bury both of us, and you did it without—" He stopped. "You didn't need me to validate what you were doing. You just did it." She held his eyes. The snow came down, light and unhurried. "I want you to stay," he said, "not because of the ranch, not because of what you've done for it, because of what you are, which is a specific and unrepeatable person I would like to know for longer than 6 weeks in one auction." He wasn't a man who made speeches, and this was not a speech. It was the careful delivery of something he'd been carrying and had decided to set down. "I'm asking to court you properly. If that's something you'd want." Mara was quiet for a moment. The snow touched her coat and her hair and melted without drama. She had come here with nothing but a battered trunk and a tag that told her what someone else thought she was worth. She had built something, not just for the ranch, not just for Gideon, but for herself, from herself. Out of the specific competence and stubbornness and willingness to keep working that she'd been carrying her whole life through situations that hadn't deserved it. She thought about this question she'd been sitting with since the auction. What comes next? Not the Crestfall exchange registration and the herd rebuild and the spring grazing plan, though all of that was real and all of that needed doing. The other, what comes next? The one that didn't fit in ledger columns. "I'm not easy to be with," she said. "I should say that plainly." "I noticed," he said. "I have opinions about ranch management, and I will not always be wrong about them." "You've rarely been wrong about them." "I keep difficult hours, and I think about work, when I should be thinking about other things, and I'm not a woman who—" She stopped, started again. "I don't soften things. I've tried, and I'm not good at it." "I've noticed that too," he said. "I'm not asking you to be different. I'm asking if you'd be willing to be what you are, here, with me, with some intention behind it." She looked at him in the snow and the quiet of the North Corral, with the valley below and the ranch around them, and she thought about all the versions of this moment she might have had elsewhere. The ones she'd turned away from because they required her to be smaller than she was, or the ones she'd missed because the timing, or the person, or the circumstances weren't right. She thought about the pragmatic answer and the non-pragmatic answer, and the fact that in this particular case, those two answers were, for the first time in her memory, pointing in the same direction. "Yes," she said, "I'd be willing." He didn't make a production of it. She was glad he didn't. He just looked at her with the expression of a man who has been given something real and knows it and doesn't need to make a ceremony out of knowing it. They stood there another minute in the falling snow, and then she said, "The East Trough is going to freeze by nightfall if we don't get heat on the supply line." And he said, "I know." And they went to deal with it together. Winter settled over Iron Creek with the unhurried permanence of seasons that don't negotiate. December became January. The herd was wintered carefully, the management rhythms established over the fall continuing without disruption. The hands stayed through the cold months, which was not something that had been guaranteed. Hands in difficult circumstances sometimes drifted when the season allowed it, but they stayed. Dick stayed, which surprised some people and didn't surprise Mara. He was a man who respected a thing when it proved itself, and Iron Creek had proved itself. Tom stayed because Tom had decided this was where he was, and Tom's decisions, once made, appeared to be structural. Ned and Pete were never going anywhere. Letters arrived. Boyd Reeves wrote in January confirming Iron Creek's place in the spring Crestfall Exchange Sellers Register, with conditions about weight thresholds that Mara read twice and then set aside because they were already meeting them. Elias Greer in Crestfall, the merchant who had retreated from their grain contract under pressure, wrote an awkward letter expressing interest in re-establishing the supply arrangement and apologizing for circumstances beyond his control in language that acknowledged what had happened without quite saying so directly. Mara wrote back briefly and civilly and agreed to the supply terms. Greer was not Silas. He was someone who had been afraid of Silas, which was a different condition and one that could change now that Silas's position in the valley had changed. That position had changed, not all at once and not completely. Men like Silas Crow didn't lose everything in a day. And he had other holdings and other relationships that the auction hadn't touched. But the Valley's understanding of him had shifted in the particular way of collective understanding, which moves slowly, but once moved is very hard to move back. The North buyers who had read Vane's attestation had talked. The ranchers at the auction who had watched Treen put his papers away had talked. The story of what Silas had done, paying an agency to send a woman to a struggling ranch as a weight to break it, had the quality of a story people repeated because it confirmed something they had suspected but not been able to name. He did not come for Iron Creek again that winter. Whether he was reconsidering, regrouping, or had simply determined that the situation no longer offered a reasonable return on effort, Mara didn't know and didn't spend much time speculating. She paid attention to what was in front of her. That had always been her practice, and it had consistently served her better than paying attention to what was far away. Harold Treen resigned from the First Territorial Bank in February, citing health reasons in a letter to the bank's board that nobody entirely believed. His replacement was a younger man from outside the valley who had no existing relationships with any of the cattle operations and seemed to regard that as a feature rather than a deficiency. In March, Gideon built a new gate. It was not an extravagant project. He did most of the work himself over 3 days when the ground was workable and the weather cooperated, and Pete helped with the post setting and Tom with the hardware fitting. It was solid construction, well joined, built to last in the specific way of things made by people who intend to be somewhere long enough to care about their durability. When it was done, Gideon lettered it himself. He was not a man with particular gift for decorative work, and the letters showed it. They were serviceable rather than elegant, cut into a planed board with a careful hand. But they were clear, and they would last, and clarity and durability were more important than elegance. The gate read, Iron Creek, Hale and Ellsworth. He put the board up on a Sunday morning when the light was still early and the hands weren't yet out, and then he went and found Mara in the barn where she was doing the morning check. Come see, he said. She came and saw. She stood at the gate in the early March light with her coat not quite buttoned yet, her breath visible in the cold air, and she looked at her name on the gate of a ranch she had arrived at 6 weeks before everything, and which was now, unmistakably and in written letters, part hers. She thought about the tag, the red twine and the paper label and the public laughter and the way she'd stood on the platform looking at it with the particular internal steadiness of someone who has been told what they're worth by cruel people often enough to know that the information is not reliable. She thought about getting into the wagon, not because she was certain of anything, but because not getting in would have been letting the tag be right. She thought about the accounting ledgers and the drainage channels, and the cold shed, and the dark ride after cattle, and the auction ground, and Lenore's voice in front of a crowd. She thought about all the things she'd built and done and proved, not to Silas Crow, not even to Gideon, but to the only audience that finally, actually mattered, herself. That was the thing nobody tells you when you're standing on a train platform with a cruel label tied to your luggage. They don't tell you that the tag isn't really about you. It's about what the person who made it needs to believe. It's about their architecture, their requirements, the particular structure they've built that requires you to be small in order to stay standing. You can walk away from the tag. You can have it removed by someone with decency. But the deeper work, the work of not believing it, the work of continuing to move through the world as though your own assessment of yourself is the relevant one, that work is yours alone and it takes longer than a conversation or a rescue or even a victory at auction. It takes years sometimes. It takes the kind of sustained effort that looks from the outside like competence and determination and skill, and is all of those things, but is also something else underneath, is also a person insisting every day in the specific language of action and work and showing up that they were never what the label said. Mara looked at her name on the gate. The letters were unbeautiful and permanent. "It's a little crooked," she said. Gideon looked. "Second letter H," he said. "I noticed after I'd committed to it." "I like it," she said. He looked at her sideways. "You like that it's crooked." "I like that it's real." She turned from the gate. "Come on, the Angus calves need checking before the morning feeding." They walked back toward the barn together, and the gate stood behind them in the early light with both their names on it, crooked and clear and entirely theirs. There's something worth saying about what happened at Iron Creek, and it isn't the thing that sounds good in summaries. It isn't that hard work wins. Sometimes hard work loses. It isn't that the truth comes out. Sometimes the truth comes out too late, or to an empty room, or to people who don't have the power to act on it. It isn't that cruel people always face their consequences. Anyone who has lived in the world long enough knows that isn't reliably true either. What happened at Iron Creek was something narrower and more specific, and maybe, because of that, more honest. A woman was sent to a place to fail. She was chosen specifically because someone believed her history of difficulty made her likely to fail. That person was not entirely wrong about her history. It had been hard, and not all of it had been her fault, and some of it had broken things in her that she was still in the process of reconstructing. What he was wrong about was the conclusion he drew from it. That difficulty experienced is the same as difficulty surrendered to. That a person's hardest moments are their definitive ones. She kept working, not because she had a plan that guaranteed success. She didn't. Not because she was certain it would turn out right. She wasn't. She kept working because the work itself was real, and real work on a real problem was the only thing she had always been able to trust. The cattle either got healthier or they didn't. The numbers either added up or they didn't. The fence either held or it needed fixing. That clarity, the lack of ambiguity in a thing that is either working or not working, had been the most reliable comfort of her life, and she held on to it through 6 weeks that could very easily have gone the other way. And Gideon, he was not a man who rescued anyone. He hadn't taken the tag off the trunk to rescue her. He'd done it because it was wrong, and the directness of that motivation, the absence of strategy in it, was what had told her something true about who she was dealing with. He'd been honest about the debt and the risk from the first moment. He'd asked for 6 weeks and trusted her to deliver them, and had not, in the way of men who cannot tolerate uncertainty, tried to manage or override the process she was running. That restraint, that willingness to let competence be competence without needing to supervise it, was its own kind of rare. Two people in a difficult situation, telling each other the truth about it, doing the work it required, and not flinching when it got harder than expected. That's not a remarkable story. That's what most things worth having actually look like from the inside, where there's no audience and the outcome isn't guaranteed and the work is cold and unglamorous and just keeps being what it is. Until one morning you look up and the numbers have changed. The following spring, Iron Creek met the Crestfall Exchange threshold. Pete recorded the qualifying weights in the log on a Tuesday morning in late April with the handwriting of a man who has been waiting to write a specific number for a long time and writes it carefully. He brought the log to Mara and set it on the kitchen table without comment. She looked at the number. She thought about telling him what she felt about it and decided the feeling was already visible enough. "Good," she said. "Yes," Pete said. He picked up the log and went back to work. That evening, after supper, after the hands had gone and the house had settled, Mara went to the front room and looked at the two things above the window. The faded red tag on its piece of twine, the mortgage release folded alongside it. They'd been there since November, and they were already in that particular way of objects that have been in a place long enough, just part of the room. She stood and looked at them for a moment. Gideon came to stand beside her. "The exchange letter came," she said. "We qualified." "I know," he said. Pete told me. She looked at the tag. She thought about everything it had carried, everything it had been meant to do, and everything it had actually done, which was the opposite of what was intended. The thing that was supposed to define her arrival had instead started everything that mattered. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you just let it be?" she said. "Left it on the trunk." He was quiet for a moment, thinking about it honestly rather than giving the easy answer. "I think you would have gotten back on the train," he said. "Maybe. And I think the ranch would have gone under by January." He looked at the tag. "But the honest answer is I didn't think about any of that. I just saw a wrong thing and removed it." He paused. "I don't think either of us got here by strategy." "No," she said. "We got here by showing up and doing what was in front of us. Every day." "Every day," she agreed. Outside, the creek ran over its stones in the spring dark, full with snowmelt from the high ground, louder than it would be in summer. The east field was green. The north fence was solid. The gate at the entrance to the property bore two names in imperfect letters that weren't going anywhere. Inside the front room, in the yellow light of the lamp, Mara Ellsworth and Gideon Hale stood together and looked at a small faded tag that someone cruel had tied to a trunk handle once, intending damage, and had instead given them the beginning of something neither of them had been looking for and both of them had needed. Some things work out. Not because they were destined to. Not because the people involved were special or chosen or protected by anything larger than themselves, but because two ordinary people in a hard situation kept choosing every day to keep going. That's all it was. That's everything it was.